Okay, it's 10 o'clock, so we'll get started. Welcome to the MnSTAC Forum for March, and I'm happy to introduce today Deb Hilbert from the University of Florida. Deb and I have worked together on some research, actually the research she's going to talk about, and we both are on AREA, the Arboriculture Research and Education Academy, and Deb is the president-elect, so you're going to be president here, I think, in August of this year. So a lot of great work that Deb has done down in Florida, both with teaching and outreach in matters of urban forestry and arboriculture. And so to give Deb the maximum amount of time, we're going to let her get started. I just want to remind everybody, please keep your mics off. If you have questions throughout, please put them in the chat, and then I will help Deb answer those or get those questions to her at the end of her presentation. And then Ryan will help us out with ISA CEUs at the end of the presentation. So Deb, without any further talking from me, please go ahead.
There we go. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. And I am going to talk to you all about some research I did with Eric and some other folks. And then I'm going to also elaborate on how we took this research and did a case study in Florida to create planting space recommendations, specifically for communities in Florida. But the process is something that can be replicated in any community using trees that are specific to your region. So hopefully you'll come out of this not just with an understanding of the research, but also with ways to apply it to your practice. So this was definitely a team effort. I cannot take sole credit for this. The research builds on some work that Eric or Dr. North had worked on a few years ago in Minnesota, looking at how to estimate trunk flare or the base of the tree by measuring diameter at breast height, or DBH is what we sometimes refer to it as. And so he did that work in Minnesota, and then we in Florida were being approached by practitioners about doing similar research down in Florida. And so we reached out to Eric and some other collaborators to create this team to continue the research. And the reason we did this research is because, as you know, there is a lot of conflict between trees and then adjacent hardscapes or pavements, specifically streets, sidewalks, and curbs. So there's that issue with damage and the cost that comes with the damage that constantly has to be repaired. But then there's also the issues related to safety. So when you have sidewalks that are cracking or lifting, it can cause a real hazard. And not just injure people, but also result in like lawsuits and things. So over time, it can become extremely expensive. I know in Florida, municipalities spend millions of dollars on repairing sidewalks, specifically due to conflict with trees. And then, like I said, in Florida, we had been approached by lots of practitioners to deal with this issue because it had started making the headlines, especially over the past 10 years, because what happened is about 15 to 20 years ago, folks in Florida decided to plant live oaks, which are a massive tree, Quercus virginiana. They decided to plant them in little planting strips in between the sidewalks and streets. So then 15 to 20 years later, which is about now, those trees are really starting to damage, especially the sidewalks. So this is causing a lot of conflict between not just the infrastructure, but also the community. We have the folks who don't want to cut the trees down, who are really upset by the community managers who are trying to explain that it's expensive and there's a reason for having to cut down hundreds of mature oaks at a time. But overall, it's a really sticky situation. And so we were excited to be able to partner with Eric and our other research collaborators to try to get down to understanding how we can reduce this conflict. And it's not just the infrastructure damage that is an issue. So when you have trees that are directly next to hardscapes, whenever there's construction or redevelopment activity that requires root cutting or any other like major changes in grade, then you can actually end up damaging the tree. And a lot of times if you're cutting through large structural roots, not only are you making the tree unstable, but you can actually cause the tree to die eventually. So it's not only bad for the people and the sidewalks, but it's also can be really damaging to the trees themselves. And this problem comes from kind of two different sources. There's the tree-related part of the problem, and this really comes down to the anatomy of the tree. So at the base of the tree, there's a region called the root crown, and you have the part where the trunk is flaring out. Some people also call it the trunk flare, the root flare. And that region is usually like right above or at ground level. And then it is the point in the tree where the roots start emerging. So you're having a transition between the trunk tissue and the root tissue, and you have these massive structural roots that are emerging from the trunk. And again, this area is usually elevated at surface level or maybe just below. So that's where a lot of the conflict is happening between sidewalks and streets and trees. It's at this region where you have a lot of expansion of powerful roots and the trunk flare at ground level. There has been a lot of work done on minimum soil volume. So I do want to throw that out there that this is a totally different issue. So even if you have the right amount of soil volume in your planting space, like in a long planting strip, you can still have issues with infrastructure if you don't have the right planting distance or width. And so for the rest of this presentation, we're going to be really focusing on this planting distance or width at ground level. So how far to put the tree from hardscape or pavement. There's other really good literature out there on minimum soil volume, and a lot of municipalities already implement standards for that. So the goals of this research project really came down to a few different things. So we wanted to look at the relationship between tree size and damage. And then we also wanted to examine the relationship between diameter at breast height and then trunk flare diameter. And so diameter at breast height would be the part of the tree labeled A right here, and then the trunk flare diameter, well, actually what's marked is more like the circumference, but the trunk flare is down here at point B. So we want to understand the relationship between A and B. Is it a constant ratio? So as A increases, does B increase at the same rate? That's really what we were trying to understand, because that's what will allow us to predict the size of B. And the research that Eric had done that was published in 2015, they had found that there is a constant relationship, which is awesome. And so we just took that research and expanded it to even more species and more regions. But we also wanted to look at whether other parts of the tree or the environment were affecting that relationship. So if you had a tree that was in a grassy lawn area, is the trunk flare going to be a different size in relationship to the diameter at breast height, or is it going to be the same versus a tree that is maybe planted in bare soil? And then, of course, we wanted to take our findings and create equations, because that's where the really useful part of this research comes from, is being able to predict your trunk flare diameter. And then what I'm going to show you at the end of the presentation is actually creating recommendations from those equations. So this research was conducted in 3 different communities in 2 different regions of the United States. So in Tampa, we looked at 2 species, 2 really large common oak species that are planted along streets. In Milwaukee, they looked at several different species. And then in Minneapolis and St. Paul, which we ended up lumping together at the end because there wasn't a lot of difference, they looked at 4 different species. So we had a lot of species to work with. You don't have to read all these. The gist of this is that we focused on medium and large stature trees. So we weren't looking at small trees for the study, and we weren't focused on tropical climates. We were really honing in on these medium and large stature shade trees. And the way we went about this research was pretty fun. We had to do a lot of collaboration over Zoom and emails to make sure we were doing it the same way in the different areas. But what we were trying to measure was the circumference of the trunk flare, so at ground level. And we had to be really careful not to measure the roots. We wanted to measure that transition point. And so one way we came up with in Florida to do it, because in Florida we have a lot of trees with huge buttressing roots that get damaged a lot by mowers or are really old and gnarled. And so it can be kind of hard to pick out where the root and the trunk kind of separate. So we actually put flags at those points of separation, and then we wrapped the tape around that, and that was really helpful. And then from that, we took the circumference and calculated diameter to get the trunk flare diameter. And then, like I said, we wanted to see if there were tree or environmental factors that could be affecting trunk flare development. So we also looked at things like stem girdling roots. We also looked at tree condition rating in Milwaukee and Florida. We looked at those parameters. And then we also measured boulevard width and distance to the closest infrastructure. And then we looked at ground cover, presence of irrigation, and some other factors, just to make sure that we were picking up any variables that could influence that relationship between diameter at breast height and trunk flare diameter. So just looking at the damage, there was a lot of damage. So in all of our communities, we had a decent amount of damage that was associated with the adjacent trees. And this included things like recent sidewalk replacements or grinding. Sometimes that's a way to deal with it, is you actually grind down the pavement to try to level it off. There's also a lot of instances of the sidewalk lifting or just cracking and crumbling. It was more common overall in Tampa and Milwaukee. The trees, especially in Tampa, were larger. And so that kind of plays into this graph, which is basically just showing you that as diameter at breast height increases, the odds of that tree being associated with damage also increases, which is what we would think, right? The bigger the tree, the more likely to damage the adjacent infrastructure. So that's good. But what the numbers in this graph mean is that if you had a tree that had a diameter at breast height of 50 centimeters, it's 2.4 times more likely to be associated with damage than a little 10 centimeter diameter at breast height tree. And then I want to point out one more thing about this. So it says no records and records available. So in Milwaukee and St. Paul and Minneapolis, they were able to provide some records on when the sidewalks were installed or when curbs were installed, and as well as some planting dates to really hone in on and make sure that the tree was most likely the thing that was causing the damage. In Tampa, we didn't have those records, so we had to just use our best judgment to try to guess, like, yeah, this damage is coming from this tree and not something else like shifting temperatures or, you know, what have you. But the relationship was pretty much the same, whether you were verifying the damage with records or just kind of using your best judgment as someone who's familiar with trees and sidewalks. We got the same results. And that's really good news, because that means that visual assessments of damage are probably pretty reliable, which is awesome, because not very many cities have good sidewalk installation date information, at least not in Florida. So here's some other results. So it turns out that things like ground cover, stem girdling roots, and some of the other things we looked at don't actually affect the overall trunk flare diameter size in relationship to DBH. There were a couple of factors that were slightly significant. So there was a difference between a couple of the communities and also boulevard width, but only for some species. And then when we plugged in diameter measurements just to try it out, the resulting change in trunk flare diameter was only a couple centimeters. So it may have been slightly statistically significant, but it wasn't practically significant. And the reason this is really good news for us and for you guys is that it means that we were able to just kind of ignore all those extra environmental and tree-related factors and keep them out of those equations and just give you a really nice, clean equation that relates diameter at breast height to trunk flare diameter. And these are the graphs that show that. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically what you're seeing is as diameter increases, trunk flare diameter also increases at a pretty constant rate. So when all the dots, which are individual trees, fall close to the line, that means the rate is pretty constant. And that's good news. And then we saw similar results in Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Minneapolis with their shared species. And then in Tampa, we had very similar results. So this is awesome. And then from that, we could pull out these simplified equations. And what this says is if you want to estimate trunk flare diameter, which I said earlier is kind of tricky to get. I mean, we had to practice, even as researchers who spend a lot of time looking at trunk flares, we had to really calibrate ourselves and get out in the field and practice to really nail down how to measure trunk flare diameter. So it's not something that I would expect everybody to go out and do, let alone have the budget and time to go out and do. You probably measure DBH though. That's probably something that is part of your inventory process. So what you can do now is you can simply multiply the DBH of the tree you have by this rate that we got from those last graphs, and then you have an estimated trunk flare or base of the tree. So what if your trees are not listed in this list right here? What we did is we generalized our equations based on habitat group. So we're looking, for our trees, we're looking at the USDA Plant Atlas wetland specifications to categorize our trees. I don't know what the best method would be in the UK or elsewhere, but I'm sure you have a similar resource where you can kind of categorize your trees based on upland, wetland, and variable. And then from there, we have these more simplified predictive equations. So they're a little less specific to the trees, but they're still a really great tool if your tree isn't listed in the prior list. So what can you do with this? I think the biggest thing, and probably the reason a lot of you are listening today, is you can take these equations and actually create planting space recommendations from them. So there's a lot of research that has looked at damage to trees during construction and planting distance from sidewalks to avoid damage to construction, and a lot of them come up with a figure of around 1.2 to 2 meters distance needed between the trunk and your infrastructure if you're going to avoid conflict with both the infrastructure and the tree. So it's kind of like your safe buffer zone. If you want that tree to grow up to be full size and not have a lot of damage either to itself or to the sidewalks, then you're going to need a buffer between the trunk. So what this would be for our trees is about 1.2 meters or 4 feet between the tree trunk and the sidewalk, or tree trunk and the street. Now, if you're dealing with tropical trees, it's going to be larger than that. I've only come across a couple of papers trying to figure out what that buffer would be, but a lot of them say it's going to be over 4 meters because like this tree down here, we have a kapok growing in my city. It has massive bunches of roots, so you're going to need like a much larger buffer zone. But you can take your estimated trunk flare diameter, add your buffer zone, and you actually have now a planting distance. So this would, in the center of this tree is where you would plant the tree. This is kind of your estimated trunk flare, and then you have your buffer. I am going to explain this a little in a little more detail by using a case study from Florida. So what we did after we wrote up this article and published it with Eric and our other collaborators is we got in touch with some Florida extension agents who were working on urban forest management plans, specifically dealing with trees and infrastructure. And they were all wanting to know, like, how do we deal with this issue? It's making the news, it's making residents upset, it's obviously causing issues for the cities as far as the amount of work and money that is going into it. And so we're like, okay, we'll work with you. We'll take these equations that we created and we'll actually look at creating a list of recommendations for trees in Florida cities. And again, this is something that other communities can do. So to do this, we basically just looked over planting lists throughout all of the state of Florida and came up with the most commonly planted medium and large stature trees. And then we looked up their maximum DBH. Originally, we were trying to get it from city tree inventory data, and then we realized that, first off, there's not a lot of it. And second off, a lot of trees are removed prematurely anyways before they reach the mature size, so maybe that's not the best way to go about it. So what we ended up falling on is to look through champion tree registers. So obviously these are the biggest of the big. I don't expect most city trees to get that big, but it's kind of like in a best case scenario, genetic lottery winner, this is how big the tree could get. And we called this the maximum genetic potential. which is like kind of an obnoxious phrase I realize in retrospect, for basically these are the biggest trees. How big can the tree get? And then we plugged in those big DBH values for the like maximum mature size, and we got the maximum mature size for the trunk flare. So it's like, if you have this tree planted and you want it to grow to be as big as it can get, then this is as big as its trunk flare is going to get. And then we added a buffer, remember, because you need that buffer between like those large structural roots and that zone of rapid taper, where you can still have conflict with sidewalks and construction. And then we came up with our table of recommendations, which I'm going to show you. So here are some visuals to explain what I'm talking about. So let's say that we are dealing with planting distance. So you have some hardscape on one side and then none on the other side. You have plenty of space over here. So you're just concerned about this distance. So before you plant the tree, you can figure out, all right, well, this is a Quercus virginiana. It's probably its maximum genetic potential is going to be such and such. For these guys, it's really big. And then to get the planting distance, you're going to half that, right? Because you're just planting right here. And then half the trunk flare diameter. Oops, don't click. And then you, again, need that buffer. And then you come up with your recommended planting distance. For the planting width, so if you're in a planting strip or a boulevard, you're basically just gonna double it, or you're gonna say, I need the max trunk flare diameter and then I need a buffer on each side. And so that's your recommended planting width. So that's what you're looking at in this table. Again, the maximum genetic potential, those were the champion trees. So when we went through all the champion tree registers for the state of Florida and the US for our species that we were looking at, we came up with these planting distances and widths using our equations. And so, for example, Acer rubrum, which is pretty common throughout the eastern United States, is going to need about 8 feet distance from a sidewalk or a street, or it's going to need a planting width of about 16 feet if that tree is going to get to be the champion tree size. Maybe it won't. So maybe it's more likely it's going to get to be like 70% of that size or only 50% of the size. So we went ahead and gave you some other options. And this is kind of to help practitioners think through like, okay, well, we don't normally see red maples get to be this large, but we do get to see them being maybe like 75% of that size. So then you get slightly different recommendations for these other options. I prefer just to look at the maximum genetic potential just to be on the safe side, but that's not always an option, especially when you're dealing with super densely urbanized areas. Okay. And then we took the different generalized equations that I had talked about for all those trees that aren't on any of the list, and we came up with just some more general equations for Florida practitioners. So we told them, okay, so if you have an upland tree and it typically gets to be about 10 inches in diameter at breast height, we'll plug it into the trunk flare equation, add our buffer, and we're recommending about 1.5 meters or 5 feet from a sidewalk, or a boulevard width of about 9 feet. This is normally the point in the presentation where I'd look at all your faces and make sure you're with me, but it's so hard on Zoom. And then we did the same thing for variable species and then for wetland species. Now I'm going to give you one more example. So I'm trying to help you look at this a few different ways, just to let it really sink in. So I picked out green ash as an example because that's really common up in Minnesota. I don't expect you to be planting a lot of it right now with emerald ash borer, but it is really common along the streets. So I said, okay, let's just pretend that the maximum diameter at breast height for most green ashes along streets is around 30 inches. I may be way off, but I think that's probably a pretty good estimate. So what you would do is you would plug in 30 inches and multiply it by the factor that we got from our research. So this is the equation from the research. And then you get an estimated trunk flare diameter from that of about 39 inches. Sorry for the folks in the UK, but I'm working in inches and feet now. So then you need to convert that into feet since you're going to be adding a buffer that's in feet. And so you just divide by 12. And then you end up getting planting space recommendations of 11 feet. So you should, if you want to let your green ash tree grow to be full size, avoiding as much conflict as possible, then you're going to need a boulevard of about 11 feet. Or you need to plant it about 7 feet from a sidewalk. I know that doesn't happen, right? That's part of the reason why we're doing this research, is because that's definitely not the case. A lot of times they're planted in boulevards that are only about 3 feet wide. And it's the same thing down in Florida with our large oak trees. They get planted in very narrow strips. But it's a really powerful tool though, because what it does is it not only gives you these minimum planting distances for planning. So when you're revising your ordinances or you're trying to come up with tree placement, you can now look at these equations and these recommended planting distances and really reduce the amount of future conflict. It's a long-term plan, right? So you're thinking in 10 to 15 years from now, I don't want to be removing these trees. I don't want to come in and have to cut down hundreds of trees. So we're going to just do it as conservatively as possible, and we're going to give it this much distance. It also helps with like inventory records, because what you can do is if you have an inventory of street trees where you have DBH measurements, you can plug in the DBH into that equation for that species or the generalized equations, and you can come up with an estimated trunk flare diameter. So you can actually have, like in your inventory data set, you can have like your column of DBH, and now you can have your column of estimated trunk flare for each tree. And then you can overlay that with planting records for like if you have information on planting widths. So maybe in like the public works department, you have information on nearby sidewalks or sidewalk layouts in streets. You can actually overlay that with this data, and what you can do is you can pinpoint where you might be having conflict. And this is really powerful because you may not have time to go out and look at every single tree all the time. So this can help you really prioritize, oh, look, we have like a bunch of 30-inch green ash growing in an area where this record says it has like narrow right-of-ways with sidewalks. So we should probably go out there and make sure we don't have any major lifting or cracking going on. So it can really help you prioritize. Also, these are equations that can be used for estimating stump sizes a little more accurately than some of the more general equations, because again, most of them are species specific from our research. Now, I do want to point out that I don't think this is solely an issue of wrong tree, wrong place, at least at this point in time for us. It was 20 years ago when they were putting these trees in these little tiny meter wide planting strips. And where we're at now is we need to make a decision about whether we want these large trees in streets. And so there are ways to deal with design. So I don't think it's solely a tree issue. I think it's also a design and a planning issue now, where we might need to start thinking forward, especially in light of all these canopy goals that cities are setting. Well, if you want to maximize canopy, you need huge mature shade trees. And if you want huge mature shade trees, then you need space for it, right? So there are ways to deal with it as far as redesigning or at least implementing some modifications to paved areas. Up here is a book that's really helpful. It's called Reducing Infrastructure Damage by Tree Roots. And it's actually a compendium of insights from practitioners in our field. And so there's really good case studies and examples of things you can do, like bridging, recessed planting pits, like you see in this picture right here, where the grade for the tree pit is just slightly lower than the pavement grade. There are mixed results with that depending on what climate you're in. So you definitely want to feel out who's had success with this in similar areas to your community, but there are solutions, I guess is my point. And so maybe you can even start thinking about shrinking the size of roads. That's something that's happening in Europe a lot, is they're realizing they really want trees in the cities, so maybe it's time to start focusing more on walkable or bikeable areas and try to shrink some of those large roads to make space for trees and for pedestrians. That has to be a community decision, but it's definitely an option. So I'm gonna wrap it up here. We have a ton of people to thank for this project. Again, this was a project that spanned 3 different communities around the U.S., and we had tons of partners. I won't go through all of them right now, but I definitely want to acknowledge that this was a team effort. And here's where you can find our information. So I'm ending a little soon because I figure a lot of you probably have a lot of questions, but if you want to find the extension article that we wrote about the Florida case study, where we came up with the tables of recommendations, this is the article to look for, and it's a free publication because it's an extension article from the University of Florida. So you can either just look up the title, or you can type in ENH132 tree space in Google and it'll pop up, or you can actually go to the UF extension website and look up the article by this tree number. Honestly, I've tried it in Google a few different times and it pops up for me. So you can also reach out to me. My email is down here, and feel free if you're having trouble finding this article. If you want the research article, then you can reach out to me or Eric, and we'll be able to share it with you, so long as you don't post it to a public site. We would be happy to share the research with you, and he can share the research he did a few years before as well, where he came up with predictive equations for Minnesota specific trees. Speaking of which, on Eric's website, he also has a calculator to estimate trunk flare diameter, and these are for the species that are more often found in Minnesota. So this would be especially helpful for all of you who are listening in Minnesota. You can go to his website, Notes on Trees. I don't know if he has it yet on his University of Minnesota website. He'll have to let me know, but I know for sure you can find it on his Notes on Trees website. And there's a little tab for finding or estimating trunk flare diameter. So that's a great resource too. So thank you guys. Like I said, I'm ending a little early because people tend to have a lot of questions about this, and I definitely want to give you plenty of time to address everything. So yeah, I look forward to hearing what you guys have to ask.
All right, thank you very much, Deb. We're all clapping. You can't see it, but it's happening. I posted, just so folks know, I posted a few of the links Deb was talking about in the chat. So if you want to open that up, there's links to the Florida extension article, and Deb's email is in there as well. So if that's easier for you to copy and paste out. The other thing I wanted to note, and I can put the link in the chat as well, there was a question that came in asking about saying, this is great information. I know this is being recorded. Where can I find that information? So in the chat, I am putting in a link to our YouTube channel for the University of Minnesota. Ryan very kindly takes these and edits them out the ends of it so that we get just the presentation bit, and posts them usually within a week or so after the forum is up. So if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, YouTube will tell you when it's ready to view, but you can then share that as you wish. There were a couple of questions that came in, so I'm going to just scroll up here. The first one came in from Aaron Hatch. Since species wetland indicator status may vary based on region, at least slightly, how do the generic equations take that into account?
Excellent point. They do vary. So for Florida, we were specifically looking at I think they classify it as the Southeast Piedmont region. So if you were to take predictive equations and try to create your own generalized equations, definitely stick to your region as much as possible. So yeah, that's a great point. So for the general research we did through the 3 different communities, we tried to match the trees to the region where they came from as much as possible to be consistent with the recommendations from USDA.
Good. Yeah, I'll just add to that, since we had talked about this a lot in the research meetings. The idea of the generalized equation was essentially that if you're a tree that has adapted and evolved to grow in a wetland area, you probably on average produce a wider trunk flare, and for stability reasons. And so really just looking at that for wetland versus maybe not wetland species for how large of a trunk flare you might anticipate. And let me see. For those who are working, this comes from Dan Wattenhofer. For those who are working in areas where there are already fixed boulevard width, is there a way to use this information proactively to inform species or as a way to avoid infrastructure conflicts?
Okay, so I am assuming what Dan means is if you're like stuck with this boulevard width and you can't change it, then yeah, so what this could do is, one, it could let you pinpoint where you might be having conflict if you need to go out and survey and look for damage. And also it can inform future species selection. So it can be used as a tool for, once those trees are removed, we need to put in something that's not going to cause issues. So we can use these equations and look for species that might actually fit in this boulevard width. If it's a small boulevard width, you're probably not going to be able to put like a massive shade tree, one of these medium or large stature shade trees, without having to do some sort of adaptation to either the tree planting pit or just picking out a smaller species. I think I answered your question, but if not, Dan, let me know.
Well, people are maybe, excuse me, thinking about some other questions they might have. Deb, you talked about the communities, you had some newspaper articles of people being upset about big trees being cut down. Can you tell us, you've worked a lot with communities and done some presentations. Can you tell us what feedback you got from practitioners, at least in Florida, about how these suggestions work or how they might incorporate them, and sort of what their feeling was about this?
Yeah, so I was looking for this headline and I couldn't find it for this presentation, but it's really funny because it's like the Thousand Oaks community cuts down hundreds of oak trees, which was just too perfect. So yeah, I've had mixed results. Most of them have been really positive, and a lot of practitioners have been eager to incorporate this and actually codify it as soon as possible. So I've had several communities who have already taken these planting space recommendations and actually written them into their street tree management plans. A couple of them have had to adapt slightly. So for like Quercus virginiana, which is that huge common street tree down here, they've given it at least 10 feet distance. And I think I recommended like 12 feet with our equations. So they've had to make a couple of adjustments, but they're still trying to like stick to these recommendations as best as possible. And that's happened in several communities throughout the state, which is awesome. I love it when research like instantly gets applied. And I mean, this research was really spurred on because of the practitioners. They were the ones who were approaching us and asking for it. So yeah, they were eager to apply this information as soon as possible. I've also had some practitioners reach out, and when they first hear these recommendations or they see like the table of planting distances, they're just like, there's no way, and then try to just end the conversation right there, just like, nope, we can't make that happen, or we don't have that space. And I'm like, okay. But what happens in Florida is we have a lot of new development happening right now. And this, it's not so much the case in Minnesota, or definitely not the case in like old cities in the UK. But in Florida, we're still very much expanding. We're still very much developing. And so there is this opportunity right now for these equations to be used to inform planning and design. So, and I try to like gently fight back with that argument, almost using this research as evidence that if we want to have large shade trees, if we want to reach like maximum canopy goals, or we want to keep some of these existing large trees in our cities and not have to deal with conflict with infrastructure, then we need to redesign and plan differently, especially in areas where we have that opportunity. I understand it's a lot harder when you're in like very highly developed urbanized areas. And that's where the book I told you about, the Reducing Infrastructure Compendium, that can come in really handy because it gives tips on how to like restructure your planting space as best as possible.
Yeah, excellent. I think great point on this is really helpful, especially in new development, to try and get it in the books as a way to think about how we construct trees, and definitely more challenging in existing spaces where we just have limits. Another question from Aaron Hatch. How do these recommended planting lawn widths compare to the actual widths on the ground or to standards for complete streets, like guidance documents for street design? How off are the actual widths? So the first part is, I guess, how do your recommendations compare with actually what you're seeing? And then there's probably some difference there in how off are those actual widths.
Yeah, so here in Florida, in a lot of our communities, they're off by quite a bit. I mean, like I said, live oak is the most commonly planted street tree down here, and it's massive. Like you can easily get a mature live oak that's over 100 inches or centimeters, diameter at breast height. So, and people are only just now realizing how big of an issue that is because these trees were planted about 15 to 20 years ago. So like they're only just now realizing, oh, we need more space. And so like now is kind of the point where people have started adapting their planting space recommendations within their management plans. There have been some forward-looking communities though. Tampa actually is one of the communities that have been really trying to do a better job of urban forest management for the past 10 years or so. And so they already had a planting space recommendation of 10 feet for live oaks, which is awesome. And that really came from having practitioners that were very stubborn, and they were like, no, I see that there is an issue over and over again when we have trees here. I'm just going to quit doing it. No matter how many people demand that we have a live oak here, we're just not going to do it. And they were able to get that actually turned into policy and practice. So, but for the most part, as you can tell by my face, it's pretty off in a lot of situations, at least down here in Florida. I'm not sure about up north, but I imagine it's pretty similar.
Let's see. The next question comes in from Kevin. Any communities had success requiring the wide tree borders in their ordinance? So do you know of cities where they've actually gotten it in?
Yeah, so Tampa, like I mentioned, they've been doing it. I don't remember exactly when, because they were kind of already ahead of the curve before our research, but I know they've been doing it for at least 5 years. And then Pinellas County, so at a county level, they are right now starting to implement it. So we'll see how that plays out over the next 5 or 10 years. So yeah, a lot of it's just now happening within this year, now that this research has come out. So I'm really curious to see how it gets implemented over the next several years.
Question coming in from Steve Watson. Will the equations be different with age of trees, so young trees, mature trees?
No. So what we're looking at, well, yes and no. So what we're looking at is the ratio between diameter at breast height and trunk flare diameter. And so that ratio or that relationship, okay, so I'm going to make an angle of the camera. So that relationship, which is the angle of my hand, it's going to stay the same as the tree gets larger. So it's not going to go like that as the tree gets bigger. It's going to stay the same. Hopefully this is making sense to you. It's so hard doing Zoom presentations because I'm a very visual, gesturing person. But that relationship is going to stay the same as the tree matures. And that's what we saw in our data. So our data included trees of all different maturities and sizes. And the idea was that we could actually look at that span of sizes and see what the ratio was. And it was pretty constant. Those lines were really straight. There wasn't a lot of variability, which is awesome. So Now, if you're going to plug in a 10-inch diameter at breast height, you're going to get a smaller trunk flare diameter than if you were to plug in like a 30-inch diameter at breast height. But that ratio or that relationship between DBH and trunk flare diameter is going to be the same. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, I think if it doesn't make sense to anybody, please ask again. But that good explanation. Another question came in. Any recommendations on replacing downtown trees in sidewalks? Don't want to get stuck with stumps in planter boxes.
That's not my specialty. Eric might actually be a better person to answer. I'm actually very curious about this because one thing that's come up, so this is not exactly an answer to your question, but the reason I've been thinking about this is because I think that maybe one way to address the lack of street trees or space for street trees in super urbanized areas could be to implement a cyclical like harvest schedule like you do in more traditional forestry. But the only downside to that is that you'd be left with stumps in a planting box that you'd have to deal with. And I don't know if anybody's doing that yet, but I know the US Forest Service is about to put out recommendations on urban silviculture, so they might talk about it in that recommendation. But yeah, I don't do a lot of, like personally, I don't do a lot of street tree design or development. I'm more of a biologist. So I think Eric might actually know some examples, or if somebody else knows any examples, they can share them.
I think we can just stick with that. I think you make a very good point. And this is something in some of those really hard environments, we need to be realistic about how long a tree can be there and not cause damage to infrastructure, and either design those areas differently. Some of the cool examples, which was the next part of that question, anything cool you've seen communities do, I think has been the more expensive solutions like using some sort of silvicell type of product where there's an underground piece of infrastructure that allows roots to grow out. In terms of not having a stump there, I know a few communities, instead of having the entire box be structural soil, they'll put in just the native soil in right where the tree would go. So when it does need to be removed, it can be cut and actually ground down right in place, or occasionally cut off the main roots and then pulled out. I've seen a few places do that as well. So you get the stump part out and you do leave some of the other roots in place, but that hasn't seemed to be a problem. I want to post in the chat the book that Deb recommended, the Compendium of Strategies. If for those that are interested in, I just posted. You can find it in various places. I just picked a spot you could look at it and see if you're interested in that text.